May 17th meeting of the Board of Harbor Commissioners to order, Mary.
Frank Kelly.
Present.
Will Anacushin. Betsy Kramer. Here. Charles Watson. Here. Ken Owen. Absent.
Mr. Bridley, are there any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, we have no changes this evening.
All right. At this time, we would take public comment on anything that is not on the published agenda. I don't see that happening, so we go to the first thing, which is the Harbor Commission matters.
Election of chairperson and vice chairperson. Recommendation A, that Harbor Commission nominate and elect the Harbor Commission chairperson and vice chairperson for fiscal year 2008-09 per City Charter Section 804 and the Board of Harbor Commission rules adopted August 1996. And B, review and consider changes to Harbor Commission committees and/or committee members.
All right. Commissioner Kramer.
I've jumped to nominate Commissioner Kelly as chairman again. I think you do a superb job, and I hope that you will be the chair again.
There's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? I will say that I'm honored to have your confidence, and if there's no discussion, we'll call the vote.
Mr. Chair, I would like to say that you have been an excellent chairman, and I would be delighted to serve under you.
Oh, all right. So I think by the rules we have to do it one at a time. So we'll take the vote on myself as chairman. All those in favor say aye. 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 Opposed? I'm chairman again. So I don't have to move, give the gavel to anybody. So are there nominations for vice chair? Commissioner Anacushin.
Yes, I would nominate the estimable Charles Watson, who's done an outstanding job, I think, in that position and in general as the Harbor Commissioner.
And I will second that.
Very good.
And I would say I would be delighted to have Charlie be my vice chair again. So that probably takes care of the comments and the discussion. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes again. So there's chair and vice chair. And we should probably review and consider any changes at this time to the Harbor Commission committees. And I think we all have that list. In reviewing this before we came in, did anybody see anything that they thought should change or that they would like to change? We have 2 standing committees and 4 ad hoc committees.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Bridley.
Regarding the list here, you'll note that the selection committee was noted as the 125 Harbor Way matter. I guess at that time we were doing a request for a proposal for a variety of different office suites that were available to lease at that time. So I guess there's a question whether or not we just want to make it a generic selection committee and have the individuals serve working with the property management staff and Scott on any other. We may potentially be in a situation, depending upon action later on the agenda, to look at a selection committee item pertaining to the marina laundry. And I think from time to time we're selecting new tenants for a variety of different. So I just want to point out that I think this one was set up for 125. There may be, again, dependent upon the need later in the agenda, to have that serve in a different role.
Thank you, John. Commissioner Kramer, you're acting like you're going to comment there? Okay. No?
I have no comment on that specific thing. I do have a comment. No.
Okay. I think the selection committee, the notion to drop the 125 and just make it the selection committee, that's a very good comment. And I think does anybody on the commission have an objection to striking the 125 Harbor Way off of that? Commissioner Anacushin.
I think we should ask the commissioners that serve on that committee for their opinion.
Good point. Commissioners Watson and Kramer, comments?
I think it makes sense to strike the 125. And
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, did you say that it should?
makes sense to
Just
strike.
just strike the
make it
125
generic,
and just
yeah.
make it a
Oh,
generic
make
selection.
it a standing committee.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Okay,
not a
sure.
standing committee, but just a
Right.
generic selection committee
Oh, okay.
for
That
leases
makes
not
sense, sure.
applying to 125. Okay. So, having done that, Commissioner Kramer, any kind of comment on the committees as they stand?
Yeah, I have a comment on the sustainability subcommittee that Charlie Watson and I, Commissioner Watson and I are on, and it met once. It was very interestingly, and I'm not sure whether it makes sense to meet again. I think there's an interest in sustainability, despite what it might be called, and maybe it would be solved or sufficient just to have a series of reports rather than having a specific committee. Rather than taking everybody's time up in meeting, what do you think, Commissioner Watson?
Yeah, thank you. My thought on it is I thought the staff did a pretty good job of convincing them that they've got that all under control.
Exactly.
And so I don't see any need for continuous oversight on it.
Nor do I.
Okay.
But I would be interested in reports on sustainable issues.
Commissioner Anakuchen, do you want to dive in on sustainability to any point? Or just, we'll let that...
R.I.P.
Okay. All right. So, unless somebody has some comment, I would make the motion, basically. It looks to me like we could probably leave the removing sustainability as a committee, striking the 125 Harbor Way and letting selection be generic, unless there's a request to change something. We'll just run this one more year the way the committees are set up, unless somebody has a desire to switch something around. Any question or comments on that? Mr. Bradley.
The only comment I would make is, I don't know that we can make it so finite as to say for another year, because from time to time we may come to you and ask for the formation of a new committee for a specific project or program. So just keep that in mind. We may add to this list, but I think your action tonight is kind of just, number one, look at the list we have and the players that are serving in that capacity and see if any changes should be made. It's kind of what the rules require at the first meeting of the year.
Understood, and comments appreciated. Commissioner Kramer.
We might want to appoint Commissioner Owen to all the subcommittees and committees that are listed.
That's what you get for not showing, Ken. So I'll go ahead and throw the motion out, and understanding that we can add any kind of a committee that we feel the need to. That's in our charter down inside, and I can call for a committee that we feel needs to be appointed, but just on the basis of what we have. If no one has any objection, I'll make the motion that we'll just, for the time being, leave the committees the way they stand and move on to the rest of the business for this evening. Okay. Is there any discussion? Then all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? So the committees stand with the striking of sustainability and the removing of 125 Harbor Way. That would bring us then to the approval of the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the old minutes? I'll make that motion.
And I'll second it.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that passed unanimously. The director's report.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, as part of my director's report this evening, I included, as I indicated I would some months ago, a brief oversight and review of our Harbor Commission rules and agenda process. When I was looking over this, I noted that the last time we revised the Harbor Commission rules was as far back as May of 1996. Now that just may mean they work for us, and from an organizational and an agenda standpoint they make sense, and they're simple and they're clear, and that's great, and I think that's the way they should be. But focusing a little bit more on the agenda process, there's been discussion from time to time about the distribution process, the timeliness of the reports, content of the information that we provide you periodically, and I'm also happy to say, in both my own opinion and that of my very competent staff and managers, I think we do a very good job of providing the type of information that not only you as commissioners need to have, but as the members of the public who either participate in this process or receive copies of the report can clearly understand our intentions in making recommendations or program changes. So I'll just go through this, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions or comments or feedback that you might give to us. I attached the Harbor Commission rules, so if you have any questions or concerns about those, we can discuss them. Harbor Commission agenda format really follows those rules. There's really no format or content for staff report or distribution process, but as you know, we provide you that packet each month, and we distribute that packet on the Friday prior to the Thursday Harbor Commission meeting every month. The one item that I added many years ago, probably in '96, was that to make sure that the Commission and the public is aware of things that go on within each division, not so much for action items, but just for informational items. Each of the division managers is requested or required to provide to you an informational divisional oversight report monthly, and that's what they'll do this evening. Those are not intended for you to take any kind of action. They're just informational. I think it allows us to have dialogue about things that you may have questions about. It may trigger questions or ideas that you might have about what goes on in that division or that program, and that's really the intent. They don't have to do it every month, but I'd like to have one about 6 times a year from each divisional manager. We, of course, as appropriate, provide you more with action items, and that's the ones that we're asking you to deliberate, review, and take an action on or make a recommendation, which ultimately is sent on to the City Council for their consideration. We've kind of done away with what was a more laborious paper process. We used to prepare umpteen packets that were distributed around the city. Department heads used to get them. Members of other boards and commissions used to get them. We've really gone to e-subscriptions, which means that if you're interested in getting information about this process and the meetings, you send an email or phone Mary's office, and she will add you to that list. And then as this packet is prepared, ready for distribution, you're emailed a copy of the agenda. You can also go online at that point then and look at the report, which is posted as part of our department's website. So that's really the process. I think it works well. I don't have any specific recommendations or changes that I would want you to consider. If there is something you'd like changed or modified or something that we should consider, this would be the appropriate time. And if it works well for you, that's fine. We'll move on to the next item. I'd answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Breitling. Commissioners, do you have any comments? Will, I see your call light is on. Does that mean you want to make a comment?
No comment.
Okay. Any other commissioners?
Seems to me it works well. I appreciate the reports and find them all very interesting and very happy with how it's proceeding.
So, Mr. Bradley, I thank you for reviewing this particular point. I find personally that it works very well for me. I do like to have it as a paper packet because I write and make notes, and it's easier that way to just write right on the report when something comes up, especially when we get to the exciting stuff like the budget, which can be a little overwhelming if you're looking at it on your computer screen and then you're trying to print out and you don't have the right size paper and it gets to be a mess and it doesn't work. So if this isn't too cumbersome, I like it the way it is. And I think the commission seems to be nodding their heads that they also do, so.
That's great. We appreciate it. I think it also that it works well, but if I didn't ask, then I wouldn't know that it does, so that was the intent.
And Commissioner Anakuchian had a comment, I think.
Oh, I was just going to comment that I think it's a good idea to move into the email mode as much as you can, as soon as you can, because that is truly a convenient way to communicate in our present epoch. And printing out this many pages is no big burden. So,
Would you, John, give the email location where if somebody wanted to go in, they could look at the packet when it's posted, just so that that goes out on this recording? Is it the city's website?
Yeah, if you just go on the City of Santa Barbara's website and click on Waterfront Department on the left-hand side of the screen, once you've hit the city's website, it'll give you the option to go to the various different city departments. You click on that, and it will come up Waterfront Department, and then it will also give you the opportunity to look at Harbor Commission agendas and meetings.
Okay.
And that'll get you to the packet eventually.
I'm just trying to put this information into the tape. And,
Right.
And Mary, if they wanted to send an email to you so that they could get on the e-subscription list, how would they do that?
They also sign up online.
They sign up online? Okay. Okay. M. Adams?
It'd be mAdams@SantaBarbaraCA.gov.
Okay. Good enough. That was just putting it in the record.
You bet.
All right. So if there are no further comments on that, any tentative agenda items for August?
We can either do it now, or we can do it at part
At
of
the
the
end?
end, at the end, and we can talk about whether or not there will even be an August Harbor Commission meeting. I
Okay.
think-
Well, just why don't we put it down at staff commission communications, and we'll
Right,
cover it
and
there.
and if we were, these are the two pending items, but these are not items that we're even sure will be available by August, so.
All right. If there are no further comments or questions, we'll go on to the business services report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. At the conclusion of each fiscal year, we report back to the Harbor Commission on the department's property management lease audit program. Since 1995, the firm of Pine, Waltrip, Decker, and McCoy has conducted revenue examinations, is the proper term, but we commonly refer to them as audits. They've provided that service for the Waterfront Department, the Airport Department, Finance Department for their transient occupancy tax auditing and so forth, and also to a lesser extent for the tenants of the Parks and Recreation Department. The audit program helps ensure that the percentage rent tenants are reporting their sales accurately and therefore reporting their rent accurately. The department's policy is to audit each tenant every 3 or 4 years and prior to a lease assignment or a lease renewal. Audits conducted during fiscal year 2008 are shown on the projection and include many waterfront department restaurants and 2 yacht brokers. 9 of the audits have been completed, and Seacoast Yacht Sales is expected to be finished shortly. I'd like to note that the total rent paid by these 10 tenants during the audit period was approximately $6.8 million. And that's $6.8 million in rent that was paid to the city. That's not gross sales, that's actual rent that went to the city, of which $2.3 million, or about 34% of that $6.8 million, was percentage rent, and the balance of $4.4 million was base rent. So you can see that the percentage rent generated by these leases is a very significant revenue source for the Waterfront Department, hence the importance of the lease audit program. The cost to audit these 10 businesses in fiscal year 2008 was $32,000, and $26,000 was recovered in unpaid past due rents from these audit findings. When new tenants move into the waterfront, either via an RFP or a lease assignment process, the tenants are provided with information indicating the types of records which must be maintained to remain in compliance with the lease. Waterfront leases require tenants to retain documents such as sales tax returns from the State Board of Equalization, federal tax returns from the IRS, bank statements, and supporting documentations for 5 years. And the audits currently cost the department $3,720 each. Since Pine Waltrip began the lease audit program in 1995, the department spent $300,000 on the lease audits and recovered $557,000, over $500,000 in unpaid rents and recovered audit fees. And I will point out that that was largely due to 3 very large audit findings at the inception of the program in the late 90s. And with that, I'll conclude the report and take any comments or questions from the Commission.
Thank you, Scott. Commissioner Watson.
Yeah, Scott, what do the numbers look like if you back out the two, which I think were anomalies? They were back when the that boat rental operator was underreporting his dues, and I think or his income. And I think it looks to me like that. If you take that away, we're spending almost as much on audits as we're getting, over and above what we otherwise would have gotten. So what I'm saying is, if you start your accounting or your comparison at 1997, that means you're backing out 2 years that had a total of $350,000 in recovered owed rent due. And so if you back that number out, what I'm saying is you're spending almost as much on audits as you're getting over and above what you would have gotten. Now, I suppose the argument can be made that if you weren't auditing, more people would be cheating on it. So I think it might warrant some closer consideration as to whether we're, really getting a good trade-off here. My second question is: are there businesses that we're auditing whose their percent rent increased over their base rent is big enough to justify having the percentage rent and the $3,500, $3,200, whatever it was, or $3,750 to audit each one of those. So I think I'd like to have those numbers looked at in that context. Does that make sense to you?
Certainly, Commissioner Watson, and you're absolutely right. If you back out the original 2 years of audit of those very large audit findings, it changes the numbers significantly, and we're paying more, slightly more, probably $300,000 for the audits. And if you do take out those first 2 years, then we've probably recovered $250,000. But staff believes that the audit program is still a necessary component of the lease management program. As you said, if there were no audit program, then there would be, there might be some unscrupulous activity going on in terms of reporting folks' revenue. So I think it keeps the honest folks honest. In terms of auditing tenants that pay minimal percentage rent, we've been evaluating that over the last few years, tenants that rarely or never break into percentage rent, and we audit them less frequently or not at all, depending on the type of numbers that they're generating. So we've whittled down our number of tenants that we audit to approximately 32, and our goal is to audit 25% per year, so that's about 8 per year. So we've cut down on the expenses of auditing the businesses in that manner as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any further?
Mr. Chair, the other comment that I would have it might only take one audit to prove that it was beneficial. I mean, you take this year, 2008, we recovered $22,000. It cost us $2,700 or $3,000, maybe slightly more, to do that audit. To me, if we didn't do it, then that would have been money lost, so to speak. It would have been a situation where if we did an audit, we wouldn't know that that individual or that business owed us the money. And I'm not even suggesting that it might not have been a simple error. It may just be that. But I'm of the same opinion that Scott is. If we didn't do these audits, then I think we could be criticized that we're not actually determining whether or not people are paying what they're obligated under the lease. There'd be no way for us to really say. Yeah, the first couple of years it was obvious that we should have been auditing all along because there were people that weren't paying per the terms of the lease. So I think as we went forward, people obviously knew audits were going to come. They were going to come about once every 3 years, and so for quite a while there, the things looked relatively clean and simple. And occasionally, again, mistakes are made. I don't think people are intentionally trying to underpay or underreport, but numbers are sometimes hard to keep track of, and I think that's why people get audited. That's why people have accountants. That's why people have CPAs do their numbers, because they want to make sure they're right. And I think that's what this program is based on. Scott and I have clearly looked at some businesses that don't warrant to be audited. I mean, if there's not a percentage rent provision, or they're not in percentage rent, then clearly I don't think it's money well spent. But I think for the rest, even if it looks like we're spending a little bit more money and haven't recovered as much, if we didn't do it, I think we'd be as criticized maybe for the expenditures that we don't.
Any additional comments by the commissioners? Commissioner Anakuchin.
Since I'm a bit out of my field here, can you explain to me why, Mr. Chair, Mr. Briley, why you would have a % rent in the first place, knowing that you would have to audit it and have this sort of thing happen? I'm speaking from a broad base of ignorance here now. I ask this question innocently rather than trying to be contentious.
And I'll try and answer it simply if possible, and I'll ask Scott to chime in if I don't. In most leases, you pay a base rent, and you just pay per the square footage that you occupy. When it comes to restaurant leases and retail leases, sometimes that rent is not a good function of the amount of gross revenue that's generated by the business, and the landlord is not getting as good a return from that square footage rental as they would if they collect rent based on the total gross of that business. So what we do is we have a lease that's structured that says you pay base rent, let's say it's $5, $4 a square foot for what you lease, and if you don't generate gross revenues in excess of what would be $4 or $5 a square foot, then you pay just base rent. However, if your gross revenues reach a point where they are actually paying more based on, let's say, 10% of your gross, then the landlord wants more revenue on a per square foot basis. So many of our tenants, Brophy's, Harbor Restaurant, Moby Dick's, Shoreline Beach Cafe, have percentage rent clauses which says once you break X number of dollars, in the case of Brophy's I think it's $2 million, you fall into the percentage rent category and you begin to pay us on a percentage rent basis. Some businesses have those same provisions but never get to a percentage rent factor of the lease because they don't gross that much revenue. Not many, but a few. We have a few that fall into that category. So It's a different way of calculating rent based on valuable pieces of real estate that where the landlord isn't getting as much revenue as they could on just a strict per square foot basis.
I guess at the heart of it is the premise that the landlord is entitled to the successes of the person that's renting from him. I have a little trouble with that, since that seems to be almost penalizing a business for doing well.
Mm-hmm. And I think you'll hear from our tenants feel somewhat that same sentiment. But this is nothing new. I mean, percentage rent leases are done routinely, if not all the time, in certain type of businesses, especially when it comes to restaurants. So we don't, and the good news is I don't have many tenants fleeing from these leases. The Harbor Restaurant's been there for 20 years. Brophy's has been there for 20 years. Moby Dick's has been there for over 20 years. I think they see the benefit of that lease in that location and what rent they pay, they seem to think is reasonable. So it's a marketplace thing also.
I have a comment, if nobody else has a comment on this, and that is, and I noticed that Commissioner Watson is working some numbers over there. It would seem that once we have a tenant and they have one of these leases, and we know how the basic economy is moving along, and we've seen their report once or twice, and so we know how they fit into the flow, that we might want, rather than have everybody on a schedule, we might simply have, I would almost call it a lottery, where we reserve the right to perform an audit. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to. And so, sort of like the IRS can audit your income tax, they don't. Many people escape their whole lives. Some people, like me, get lucky and have been audited 3 times, 3 years in a row. But it definitely, everybody knows, and you continue to do all of your accounting because you know that day may come and you have to be able to provide all those numbers. So that might be something staff would want to consider, because then we wouldn't have to have everybody on a regime. If they seem to be moving in pace, then maybe they are moving in pace. But if it seemed like something deserved to have a look, then bang, we do the audit. That's just an idea. Scott, something to consider. Commissioner Anakuchin again.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was going to suggest, rather than a lottery, which has an onerous connotation to it, that something driven by a random number generator that would decide if and when a person got audited, just so that everyone that was subject to percent of income was aware that they're still in the system and their number might come up, maybe not this year, maybe not the next, but certainly sometime. And I think that would accomplish a great amount of the keeping them honest, as it were. At least you'll find out how big a gambler they are.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Scott, I think we've slugged this horse pretty well now. If there are no other comments, we'll go to the facilities manager's report.
Good morning, Chairman Kelly. Good evening, Chairman Kelly and Commissioners. Excuse me. The public observation deck is located out on Stearns Wharf on the second floor of the 217 building adjacent to the Santa Barbara Vintners wine tasting. It's a very popular viewing platform for locals and visitors alike. And staff recently noticed a considerable amount of dry rot compromising the structural integrity of this facility. Staff undertook some major reconstruction consisting of replacing stringers, support braces, load-bearing posts, and replacing a section of the deck surface. Copper flashing was added to protect the exposed wood and minimize the potential for future dry rot. This was followed by repainting and revarnishing the complete balcony along with resurfacing the deck. During this time, the balcony was kept open for the enjoyment of the public and the Santa Barbara Vintners wine tasting. The majority of the work was done in-house under the supervision of Dana Orr, one of our more experienced and skilled craftsmen, and that saves the department a considerable amount of money when we can undertake these type of tasks. It's a great improvement, and I encourage you to go out and visit it if you never have. Out on the wharf, we have recently just about finished with our work effort to maintain the structural integrity and the good condition of the wharf. Staff recently completed installation of 300 deck boards along the main roadway and out in the valet parking lot. Our dive crew still has to install 5 epoxy pile jackets, and these go underneath buildings where you can't drive piles, where we try and salvage wooden piles that have started necking down in the middle. It's a kind of a unique approach, but tends to extend the life significantly and saves us quite a bit of money. Annual inspections of the piles and pile caps will start next week. As a matter of fact, we're going to try a new sort of unique way to look at the pile caps by viewing them from underneath via our dive barge standing up on a platform, as opposed to taking out deck boards, which is quite an inconvenience to staff working at night and also to the public during the day. The results of our inspections will define the scope of work for our 2009 plan, which I will report back to you when we develop that. Over at the harbor, we recently completed installing a new roof on the 117 building. The 117 building is home to the Minnow Cafe, Paddle Sports, Fish Market, Transpac Marine, and our maintenance shop, and is one of the oldest buildings in the harbor. The roof was getting old and long overdue for replacement. Cameron Roofing installed a 25-year asphalt shingle roof, and upon removal, the substructure was found to be in much better shape than anticipated. We've had some problems with that in the past, and so it kept costs down. They installed new equipment enclosures, copper flashings, drip edges, and new rain gutters. All 9 of the electric-powered roof ventilators were replaced with solar-powered attic fans. And we also installed 5 solar tubes in 2 of the suites to increase the natural lighting, which will reduce our electrical costs out in that building. The total project cost was $64,000. This project was included in our fiscal year 2008 capital improvement program, and the 125 building roof will be replaced as part of the fiscal year 2009 capital improvement program. Also at the harbor, we recently completed the sidewalk repair along the north side of the harbor. The seawall is constructed by concrete panels and sort of allows a lot of the substrate to weep through, creating voids underneath the sidewalk and in turn some sinkholes. It's been a problem for years and years and years, and so on an annual basis we replace 20 or 30 of the panels. And this year Robertson Construction Company replaced 31 of those panels. They expose the sinkholes, they backfill them with a coarser aggregate that's less likely to seep through the gaps in the panels. And they also installed epoxy-coated rebar, which they dowel into the seawall itself, which helps support the structure, and so it'd be less likely for subsidence. This project costs about $19,000 and is also included in our capital improvement program. And it's also included for every year for the next several years until we replace the whole sidewalk. Our waterfront parking lots are resurfaced every year as part of the Public Works annual slurry seal program. Different lots are resurfaced on a rotating basis, and this year it's time for Harbor Way and the Harbor Way commercial area to be resurfaced. Heavily damaged areas where we have alligator cracking will be completely ground out and new asphalt will be added. And this will commence on July 28th. The following day, July 29th, they will seal all the cracks in those areas. This is going to be a bit of an inconvenience to harbor users, since those areas will have to be closed in the morning into the early afternoon both those days, and we apologize in advance for any inconvenience. We'll be able to receive deliveries and have some operations occur, but this is sort of a necessary evil that occurs every 5 years to maintain the condition of that area. Immediately after Labor Day, the entire area will be sealed with one layer of slurry, and that will complete the whole project. It'll take about 2 days to do it, and we'll try and maintain as much access as possible to this area. This program is part of our capital improvement program as well, and the costs vary from $65,000 in any given year to up to $250,000 in any given year, and that includes the harbor main lot, which will come up in the next couple of years. As part of the parking lot program, we've recently noticed a significant increase in the number of motorcycles and scooters that are visiting the harbor, and with that, the demand for parking has increased significantly. Staff has looked at areas where we can increase parking for those while still maintaining parking for regular vehicles and all those stalls. And in your package exhibit the exhibits are reversed, but we've identified a couple of areas in the harbor commercial area where we can add motorcycle parking. Currently, we have existing motorcycle parking on the west side of the 125 building, the Marine Center building, and we have an opportunity to add a couple of motorcycle stalls behind our building near the transformers, and parking for, I believe, about 4 other motorcycles by the Waterfront Center on the south side. This is going to require the relocation of some bike racks over by the Coast Guard building, but it also provides an opportunity. We'll have more bike parking available, and this will increase motorcycle parking by about 6 in the harbor commercial area. We identified one other area in the harbor main lot. Mick, if you can change slides, please. This is over by the Los Baños pool. We currently have quite a bit of motorcycle parking by the Marina 2 bathroom and over by Marina 4 bathroom that's not used quite as much. But we have a fairly large area where we can get about 8 motorcycles in by the Los Baños pool. So we should be able to increase motorcycle parking by about 14 stalls after we complete the slurry seal and the restriping after Labor Day. This concludes my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Carl. Commissioner Watson.
Carl, thank you for a good, informative report. I did have one question with regard to Building 117, replacing the roof. That's a 65-year-old building, at least, maybe older than that. And these copper flashings and drip edges and rain gutters and downspouts are pretty expensive. And I wonder if it wouldn't have been better off with a building of that age to use sheet metal and plastic PVC gutters and downspouts.
Chairman Kelly, Commissioner Watson, the scope of work is developed by with my staff along with one of the local roofing contractors, and we have gone towards the copper in the last couple of years. This is the second roof we've replaced. Aesthetically, I believe it's more pleasing and consistent with sort of this maritime atmosphere. But as far as longevity is concerned, I must be honest that we didn't consider some longer lasting materials such as plastics. The 117 building is also considered an historic building, and we've had some issues with respect to replacing siding and a few other things. So we try and replace everything in kind to the maximum extent feasible so we don't run afoul of those folks that want to maintain the historic integrity of that building.
So you were replacing copper downspouts?
I don't believe we had copper downspouts before, to be perfectly honest. We did not. This is new, and this is something we started with the Brophy's roof a couple of years ago.
So we're spending that money for aesthetics then?
Yeah, copper lasts pretty well in the marine environment as well, I must add.
That's true.
Are there any other comments by the Commission? Carl, I would have one comment. Do we have any guesstimation on the remaining useful life of Building 117? I mean, I know it is an older building. I hate to put you on the spot.
Chairman Kelly, that's a great question. We recently did a little roof work on roof joists from the inside of the building a couple of years ago, and surprisingly, the building's in pretty good shape. Aesthetically is where we kind of have some problems. It just doesn't look that good, but we just repainted it last year, spent quite a bit of money and time and effort, and we are somewhat compromised by our inability to really change things because it is a historic structure, and they want you to not only have the same look, but use the same material. So there's been a little bit of a problem. So if we keep up on the painting, a new good roof on it, hopefully we'll get many, many more years out of it. I don't know about 65, but we'll try and get as many as we can.
Okay. One other comment, and that is with the King Harbor race coming up at the beginning of August and participants happening, will the work on the asphalt on July 28th impact the ability of the race participants to, make their preparations? And because I know they have crews coming in and all that sort of stuff. Just asking the question.
That's a good question, and it shouldn't have any problem. This work is fairly simple to do. It starts at 6 in the morning, usually finishes in the early afternoon, and so they can even use it that same day. We expect Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the 30th, 31st, and 1st, to be busy with respect to that event. So we don't expect any problems. We'll accommodate everybody to the best of our ability.
All right. Are there any further comments or questions? Then we're off to the facilities management report. No, the harbor operations report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Quick recap of our July 4th activities. We had a fairly modest crowd this year, but they turned out with great enthusiasm to enjoy our 4th of July celebration of the harbor, celebrating, of course, the birth of our country. Our biggest challenge this year turned out to be the fireworks show itself. As has been well documented, we had an electronic glitch about 10 minutes into the show, which caused about a 10-minute delay as well. But I think anybody who saw the show will recognize the fact that once it got rolling, it was actually one of the better, if not the best, fireworks displays we've had yet. In that regard, we're working with both the pyrotechnical company that ran the show and the fire department and our own staff to figure out exactly what caused that and to do our very, very best to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. But we look forward to bringing the full integrity of a full uninterrupted show back to the waterfront again next year. Also on the good news front, boaters were generally compliant with safe boating practices this year. We had no boating under the influence citations and no boating-related accidents or dangerous activities on the water. So we were grateful for that. Speaking of the King Harbor race, to reiterate, the 81-mile race, which was really the sort of one of the great highlights of our regatta season here in Santa Barbara, will take off Friday, August 1st from Santa Barbara. We expect about half the boats, 60-65, to come from Santa Barbara, and about half, 60-65, will come from other places. But and we're also hoping for a little better breezes than we've had in the last few years, so that we get some really good times. But even with the modest breezes in the last few years, local Santa Barbara boats have finished at the top of their class, and it's an honor to be able to say that, and it's also an honor to be able to welcome boats from all different harbors to Santa Barbara for this wonderful regatta. And finally, on the marine front, I may have mentioned to you before, the California Marine Life Protection Act was passed in 1999. It's a piece of legislation that directs the state to design a network of marine protected areas that protect marine life and habitats, marine ecosystems, and marine natural heritage. This process got off to sort of a stutter step start, if you will. It went about a year and a half. The California Fish and Game was funding it. California Department of Fish and Game was funding it. They ran out of monies. Private foundations, recognizing the importance of implementing this law, stepped in to underwrite the cost of that implementation, and it carried forth. In all, the state has been divided into 5 sub-regions. 2 sub-regions have been completed. It takes a year to 18 months to fully complete the process in each region. That includes not only the socioeconomic work, but in the data gathering and the habitat analysis and the input from stakeholders and the scientists and what have you, but also the regulatory process to have it codified in code. And finally, the third region is about, the study in the third region is about to begin, and that is our region. The entire region from Point Conception to the California-Mexican border has been defined as one sub-region. And as part of that process, there are several groups that are important to making the decisions as to what marine protected areas will be implemented, where they'll be implemented. One is a scientific advisory committee that is comprised of scientists, marine scientists mostly, are familiar with these kinds of issues. Another is called a Blue Ribbon Task Force, and these are the folks that ultimately make the recommendations to the California Fish and Game Commission on these marine protected areas. And then there's what's known as a regional stakeholders working group, which takes conservation interests, fishing interests, community interests, public at large interests, and selects nominations in those categories from throughout the regional area to participate in the process. And I can tell you I've had the honor of being nominated to the stakeholder working group for this region by the California Harbor Masters and Port Captains Association. I'm currently being vetted. In fact, I have interview next week with some of the folks who run the Marine Life Protection Act process. I'm looking forward to hopefully succeeding through the vetting process and participating in this. I'll be honest with you, it's going to take a lot of time and effort, but I think the department owes it to the city, and the city owes it to this community to do its very best to participate in this in a a professional manner and help to balance and help to bring some balance to the various interests at hand, especially in our region, but I'll actually, if lucky enough to be appointed to this, we'll be learning a lot and hopefully weighing in relative to the marine protected areas throughout the Southern California region. And this is really an entree to tell you that whether I'm selected to this or not, I will be here to report to you on a periodic basis as to the progress of this process throughout Southern California. It's a very important one to people who love and enjoy and utilize the sea. And with that, I would conclude my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Kronman, I wish you well, and hopefully you will be nominated and survive the vetting process. Commissioner Owen. Kramer. Yeah. Well, Ken's normally here.
Okay. Congratulations, Mick, and I hope you're vetted and for it, because I agree it's a very important organization, a process, rather. I do have a question about fireworks. I noticed in the paper that Heal the Ocean had made a move towards having a change in the fireworks next year, perhaps, or other years. And I wonder if Heal the Ocean has been in contact with your department about this and what's happening about it.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, Heal the Ocean has not made a direct contact with our department. What we did receive actually the day before the fireworks was a letter from a law firm which represented Heal the Ocean that put us on notice that they believe our fireworks were not in compliance and required a permit. The allegation or the implication that it needs a permit is being investigated. We've certainly had discussions with Regional Water Control Board staff about the need for permits. No one's ever told us we needed a permit for the fireworks. So whether that proves to be the case or not is something that we'll explore further and report back to you. But at this point, we don't intend necessarily to change the process or the fireworks show as you saw it this year. If we need a permit, then we'll obtain a permit in order to have the fireworks show.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no further questions, Commissioner Anakuchin.
I also tender my congratulations on your potential position, Mr. Croman. And since you probably expected of me, I will take perhaps an opposing view of these proceedings. Not really opposing, but rather amplification. A thing like seawater, sea life protection is a good idea, good sounding idea, as are many similar programs that we find as bellwethers in the times in which we live. I think that one thing that needs to be added to a program such as this is what is called in other fields outcome studies. This is in medicine and some of the biological sciences. It's quite proper to have a concern over protecting our resources. And even though enthusiasm is always welcome in these areas, there is a necessity to answer the question, well, how are we doing? How well are we performing? Was all this really a good expenditure of time, of money, of resources? And so I would admonish you, I certainly can't request you to, but I would admonish you, wherever you have the opportunity to bring up the issue of outcome. How are we measuring our progress? How are we measuring our success? What are the numbers? To the extent that you can do that, this I would recommend. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Anakuchin, thank you. That's important to know, and I can assure you that if I'm lucky enough to be accepted into this stakeholder working group, I won't be the only voice making sure, and quite frankly, I think it's part of one of the legal requirements of this piece of legislation, follow-up monitoring and enforcement of marine protected areas. That was the case at the Channel Islands process where marine protected areas were established. They've just completed a 5-year monitoring program out there. Those results, preliminary results have been issued. They're still doing further work on that, and of course, larval recruitment and all the presumptions that went into the establishment of marine protected areas will be continued to be looked at over a long period of time. But your points are duly noted and will be advanced.
All right. If there are no further comments now, we'll go to the 5-year lease agreement with Dennis Longaberger.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission recommend council approve a 5-year lease agreement with one 5-year option with Dennis Longaberger, doing business as Sunset Kid Yacht Sales for a 326-square-foot office at 125 Harbor Way, Suites 13 and 24, at a base rent of $708 per month, subject to annual cost of living increases.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, we discussed much of these terms at last month's meeting, so I'll try to keep it succinct. The department has, at this point, reached an agreement with Dennis Longaberger for the 163-square-foot office suite 24, which is adjacent to his existing office 13 and actually connected by an existing door. As Mary said, the term is a 5-year initial term. It also has a possible 5-year option to extend, with a base rent of $708 per month, which equates to $2.17 per square foot. Sort of to append to our earlier discussion, this is a percentage rent tenant. So if you factor in the percentage rent that the tenant paid, for instance, in calendar year 2007, that rent equates to $8.52 per square foot per month. So again, that's just another glimpse at how the percentage rent comes into play. We also charge in these offices a 15-cent per square foot utility surcharge for the utilities that go into these offices, and that's consistent with the other offices in the building. The percentage rent is 10.5% of boat sales commissions on new and used boats, which is, there's no change from the previous lease on that. The change is that there will be a percentage rent of 2.5% of gross sales from yacht charters. And these yacht charters are limited to charter vessels that are berthed outside the Santa Barbara Harbor. And I'll talk about that under the permitted uses clause. And again, the base rent is adjusted annually due to increases in the cost of living as measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. In terms of permitted uses, the permitted use is office space for a full-service yacht sales and brokerage business. And the new addition is ticket sales for quote-unquote mega yacht charters. And these so-called mega yacht charters are limited, again, to charter vessels berthed outside the Santa Barbara Harbor. And the intent here is to enable the tenant to get into an area that he is very interested in and believes in his expanding field, selling tickets on a commission basis, or organizing these trips on a commission basis for very high-end vessels in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, for example. The lease term, that being 5 years with a 5-year option, the format of the lease and the content is based on and very similar to the leases with Chandlery Yacht Sales and Seacoast Yacht Sales, our 3 brokers in that same building. And a copy of the lease is available for review at the Waterfront Department office if anyone is so inclined. And with that, I'll conclude the report and take any comments or questions from the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reedman. Are there any comments or questions for Scott on this point? I have one, Scott. I noticed that 13, that is his current location, so this lease supersedes his current lease in Space 13?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. His lease in Suite 13 expired quite a few years ago now, I believe 2000, 2001, and he's been occupying on a month-to-month holdover status. So that lease goes away, the new lease comes in for both Space 13 and Space 24.
Okay. That's a long holdover status. All right. Commissioner Anakuchin.
With regard to mega yacht charters, was it made clear that tickets were not to be sold to mega charters that landed here in Santa Barbara.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Anakuchin, Mr. Longaberger, under this lease agreement, does have the ability to bring in vessels that are berthed outside Santa Barbara Harbor. An example would be he's got a client in, I believe, in Ventura Harbor that could potentially bring the vessel up here, and it could be chartered out of this harbor on a temporary basis at a minimum rate of $750 an hour, 3-hour minimum. So we're looking at high-end charters. And it also has to be what is called a Coast Guard uninspected vessel, which means that vessels of less than 100 tons displacement are limited to 6 passengers or less, and over 100 tons are limited to 12 passengers or less. So this would not enable Mr. Longaberger to bring in an inspected vessel such as a vessel like the Channel Cat, a vessel like the Sea Legs that we discussed at length several months ago. So it does limit it somewhat, but it does give him the ability to do some limited mega yacht charters in Santa Barbara Harbor. But the vessels cannot be from Santa Barbara Harbor.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. It's the term mega is a bit scary, isn't it? I think of the huge ship that gave us so much pause, as you referred to. I think I would want to avoid that. If he wants to sell mega buck charters in the Med, fine. It's good business, but not in our backyard.
All right. There is an item that needs a motion. Anybody want to make a motion on this one?
My opportunity to make a motion. I move approval of the lease.
And I'll second that.
Is there any further discussion on this? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Harbor Laundry Facility. Thank you, Scott, for the good report and for finally getting this lease through.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission A review and consider alternatives for operating the 161-square-foot harbor laundry facility at 307 Shoreline Drive. B, direct staff to issue a request for proposal to identify a new potential operator for the laundry facility. And C, direct staff to evaluate any proposals received in comparison with having the Waterfront Department operate the laundry facility directly.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, the laundry room concession was awarded to a private party following a request for proposal selection process in 1998. The 161-square-foot laundry room located in the Marina 4 restroom building has 6 commercial washing machines, 4 large capacity dryers, a bill changer, and a vending machine for small amounts of detergent, bleach, fabric softener, the things you commonly find in laundromats. This equipment is all property of the lessee and will more than likely be removed at the end of his term. Just in terms of the business that this business does, the laundry room averages $20,000 per year in gross sales, and it's been very, very consistent since the outset. It varies between maybe $19,000 and $21,000 a year. It's been very consistent. And the rent is currently $364 per month that he pays to the city to run this facility. At the June Commission meeting, staff reported that the public and the harbor community is dissatisfied with the manner in which the laundry room is being operated currently, and we reported also to you that the lease, our intention is not to renew this lease in November. Staff is evaluating several alternatives for providing a higher quality facility in the harbor, and alternative 1 is Waterfront Department direct operation of the facility. Direct operation of the laundry room by waterfront staff would give the department the most control over the condition of the facility. However, that comes with a cost, and that would be that the waterfront department has a great responsibility for everything that goes on there. It would also involve unbudgeted costs of purchasing the equipment, as well as staff time collecting money from the laundry machines and so forth, cleaning and maintaining the facility. Initial cost estimates that we've received on replacing this commercial equipment for purchasing the equipment range between approximately $30,000 and $40,000, including the washers, the dryers, a new tankless water heater, bill changer, and the vending machine for the soap and so forth. And ongoing maintenance expenses could range from $13,000 to $18,000 annually for daily inspections to make sure everything's working, stocking the machines, collecting the money from them, repairs, cleaning, maintenance, and also the utilities that serve the facility, gas, water, and electric utilities. We've looked into the costs of those as well. Alternative 2 is leasing machines from a laundry company. Leasing machines from such a company has the advantage of reduced upfront costs to the department. These companies will provide and maintain the laundry machines, collect the money from them, and split the revenue with the department in a 50-50 or 60-40 scenario generally. However, the department would remain responsible for cleaning the laundry room, purchasing and stocking the bill changer with money, and the detergent vending machines, taking the money out of that and stocking the materials in there. So startup costs would be less, ranging from approximately $6,000 to $8,000 for startup to get the tankless water heater, put in a new floor, and so forth. And ongoing maintenance is estimated at $10,000 to $15,000 annually, again, to get in there and clean the place up regularly and keep it looking nice for the harbor community. The preferred alternative that we're presenting to you tonight is locating a new operator for the laundry room. And the reason for this is staff has had several discussions with local business operators in the harbor that have experience in operating laundry rooms and are interested in taking over this operation. We have a couple local folks with direct experience. As local operators already in the harbor, they'd be able to respond more quickly to equipment malfunction and maintenance needs than a leasing company could do or than the current operator has been able or willing to do. The department would not need to expend unbudgeted funds or staff time under this scenario of farming the whole project out. Additionally, the department will not need to act as a middleman between laundry room users and a leasing company when problems arise and are reported. Since there are these local entities interested in taking over the laundry room, staff recommends that an RFP should be issued to solicit proposals for a new lessee. However, that's with the caveat that once any proposals are received, they should be evaluated and compared with the alternatives of having the waterfront department operate the facility directly as described in Alternative 1 or indirectly via a leasing company as described in Alternative 2. So we're not asking to go down a road, strictly an RFP road of no return. We want to see what proposals are out there and then once again weigh these three alternatives and come up with what the best use will be for the community. It's not a money maker for the department per se. It's a service to the community that we're looking to improve here. So if the commission concurs, staff will draft and send out an RFP within 2 or 3 weeks' time so we can hopefully have a lease in front of you and a new tenant in place prior to the expiration of the current operator's lease. So I'd be happy to answer any questions on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions for Commissioner Anakuchin? I see.
Well, I don't have a question, but I would make a motion that...
Okay. I thought I saw your comment light on.
It is on. It just stays on.
Okay. All right.
I would move that we do, in fact, authorize and encourage the department to issue an RFP as described by Mr. Reinman.
And I'll second that. I don't want to second guess what you're doing. Sounds fine.
It sounds like you've looked at it,
Yeah.
all the directions that this needs to be looked at. And so if there's no further discussion on that, there are three of us, even though Charlie is absent from the room. We can go ahead and take the vote. Here he comes. So we'll pause momentarily. Charlie, there's been a motion made for the Harbor Facility Laundry Room to basically go with the staff's recommendation to direct an RFP with the caveat that they're going to compare that against the other two alternatives when they get it in. That motion was seconded. Do you have any discussion you want on it? Okay. So then all those in favor of that proposal say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. dock ladders.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission receive and consider a staff report related to the establishment of dock ladders in Santa Barbara Harbor.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, as you're probably well aware, the issue of whether or not the Waterfront Department should establish dock ladders, that is, ladders that extend or can be extended into the water to assist somebody who is in need getting out of the water, has been discussed roundly for many years, I would say, roundly discussed and keenly researched. Although if the latest was last year, in August of last year, when John Hazelton, a longtime local boater, passed away sort of tragically in the harbor, was found floating in the harbor, and we did an investigation at that time that included surveying other harbors up and down the coast, looking into costs, looking into liabilities, and looking into a number of issues and benefits, of course, related to the potential implementation of dock ladders around the harbor. At the time, we stood down on the matter, deciding that the return on investment wasn't overall worth it. And last month, the issue came up again. I believe it was advanced through an interested constituent, through Commissioner Watson, I believe it was. And so we revisited the issue again as staff and done a little more research in this regard. And I went all the way back to 2001 and looked at reports from the Harbor Patrol supervisor. I looked at a lot of reports of people who had fallen in the water and been okay, and people who'd fallen in the water and not been okay. And honestly, I couldn't find anything to countervail or countermand, if you will, the conclusions that we arrived at last year. The bottom line is that people who typically fall in the water and perish are by and large under the influence usually of alcohol, or in one case we had an individual who had a seizure. I haven't located in the past 20 years any of evidence that's come to my desk or that I've been able to find that indicates that anybody who's perished who's fallen in the harbor did so without either being under the influence of, without being under the influence of alcohol, save one, and that one individual had a seizure. We did have a Work Inc. employee fall in the harbor, according to the records I've reviewed. That individual was able to be pulled out of the harbor, and that was before Work Inc. implemented the policy that they all wear life jackets. We see them around the harbor now with flotation vests, and so that policy has changed. All the other cases that I reviewed of individuals who have fallen in the harbor were either pulled out by somebody, able to find a swim step, able to grab a line, a tie-up line, and haul themselves out, and there have been no fatalities, to my knowledge, related to people falling in the harbor who were not intoxicated or who had that one, except for that one incident that I mentioned where the individual had the seizure. I revisited the issues of cost. I contacted the company, the Up and Out Safety Ladder Company. This seems, as your attachment notes, this seems for the few numbers of marinas, and they were smaller private marinas and yacht clubs that do employ ladders, this seemed to be the type of ladder, no, not necessarily this company, the type of ladder they prefer that's sort of, it's a collapsible ladder. It stacks at the edge of the dock with a grab bar that if you're in trouble, you can grab it and pull it down. And estimating that in order to have any kind of reasonable access, that you would have to have one at either end and at mid-span on each of our docks. That includes approximately 170 to 200 of these ladders. The price for the ladders and installation would probably be in the neighborhood of $35,000 to $40,000. And considering the sort of the other side of the equation, if you'll allow me, the lack of a demonstrated need, which I explained earlier, and the quite frankly, the difficulty even then, the lack of assurance that a person who was inebriated, who fell in the water, would be able to find one of these ladders in the dark, because we haven't even talked about lighting and signage, but setting that aside with this notion, the lack of assurance that they could find it, the likelihood that the ladders would create an attractive nuisance, especially for children. You see ladders, you jump in the bay, you figure it's a place to swim and a place you can climb out. could, quite frankly, outweigh any what we believe to be minimal benefit by establishing these throughout the harbor, because boating is not only illegal, swimming in the harbor is not only illegal in the municipal code, much more important than that. Children and people swimming in the bay is quite dangerous with the amount of boating traffic we have. So in conclusion, Mr. Chair, staff believes, as it did after last year's investigation, that as well-intended as the notion of providing an additional safety mechanism in the harbor for people who are unfortunate enough to fall in the bay we don't believe it's worth the expenditure, liability, and attractive nuisance that it might create. We're happy to revisit it any time in the future if circumstances change, but that's our conclusion to date, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Commissioner Anakuchin.
Yes, thank you for that report, Mick. It pretty well sums up what it is. My reaction to it is twofold. First, rather than buying a bunch of ladders or lifesavers and signage and all the rest, just buy some insurance and let it go at that. If in a humanitarian sense you want to help people that fall in the water, I would submit that rather than a device that gets you all the way back up onto the dock, which is what a child swimmer would anticipate, it would be enough just to get them up out of the water onto a platform or a handhold or whatever. And having achieved that, then they can scream their heads off for a little help and then get duly chastised when they're pulled out of the water. So with those two suggestions, for whatever they're worth, I thank you for your report.
Commissioner Watson.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Mick, thank you for obviously a big effort here to research and put together a report, and I appreciate that. My comments would be that I think the attractive nuisance argument is not a very strong one. These ladders don't hang down in the water; they have to be pulled down. And the $35,000, if it was going to be effective in saving lives, I don't think that's an unreasonable amount of money to spend. I think the biggest problem with this approach is that how you get the person that's fallen in the water to the ladder that they can get out on. And it seems to me if someone has a presence of mind that they could actually, one, find the damn ladder and then get to it, they'd probably be capable of hanging on to a mooring line or something and yelling for help. So I think that rather than ruling this out on the basis of expense or concern over what might happen with kids wanting to use the ladders, I think the stronger argument is it's probably not practical to expect someone to be able to make use of the darn thing. So anyway, that's my take on it. But anyway, I want to thank you for doing the research and providing the report.
Any further comments on this point? I think Charlie covered it perfectly. So I won't reiterate what Charlie said. So if there are no further comments, we'll go on. There was a request from the public for comment from Hendrik Fink. Mr. Fink, if you would like to come up, the way I'm going to want to take this is basically we'll ask you to make your case within about no more than 5 minutes, and then we'll receive the staff report, and then the commission will decide what it is we're going to do, if anything.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner and commissioners. I come before you kind of wearing two different hats. The first is as a prospective mooring permittee. I received notification after you guys conducted one of your infamous drawings or lotteries late last year that I was receiving the chance to put a mooring in out in the mooring field. And in doing so, a friend of mine had her boat wash up on the beach in totally calm weather, so I had some misgivings about it, but I looked into it further, obviously, and I determined that there's an official mooring inspector list, and I guess some progress had been made on that front. I talked to Mr. Common about it at length, and he was very helpful. So I decided to go ahead and go forward with it. I ran into some roadblocks, and it came to me that I could actually become on this list myself, because I actually have some experience doing this kind of thing, and perhaps save myself some time and or at least some money in being able to install it myself. I went through the process of RFQ, request for qualification, with Mr. Common as a company that I'm a part owner and was approved. At that point, upon approval, it turns out that I had never mentioned it to Mick, and that was my mistake, that I was hoping to go ahead and inspect my own mooring, given the circumstances of other inspectors, and the fact that the agreement you have to sign with the city requires that you hold harmless the inspectors, the city, and just about everyone else if anything goes wrong with the mooring. So because of those misgivings, that was partly what urged me to also get that RFQ in there. After having some delays there, and the harbor was very accommodating due to that process. And unfortunately, it took longer than expected, and I ran into one more roadblock, which I only recently discovered back in May or so, just before my prove update was coming up, and that was that there may have been an instance where the harbor was not in compliance with the Coastal Commission's act that allows you guys to administer this whole mooring field. So I voiced these concerns to Mick, and he informed me to talk to the harbor facilities manager, Mr. Triver, which I duly did, and then I said, well, it looks, based on all of this, that I shouldn't install my mooring yet, and I also had some technical difficulties finding a mooring inspector that wasn't me, because Mick had also voiced the fact that even though I'm on the list of improved inspectors as a company, he didn't want that company doing the inspection because of a conflict of interest. And I respected that, even though I kind of said, well, can't a certified electrician do the electrical work in his own house? But he said this is a different scenario, so that was fine. I looked into other people. In any case, to make a long story short, I did talk to the Coastal Commission regarding this what I thought was a possible problem with the fact that the mooring site, according to the special conditions that the Coastal Commission has, the mooring site must be surveyed no earlier than 30 days and no later than 90 days prior to dropping all of the mooring equipment into the spot. And I had talked to the city about this, and they assured me that, yes, that was in there, but they had conducted surveys in the past, and those surveys were sufficient. So, but even though it didn't look like it based on what I was reading. So that left me with a dilemma. Mick had said I needed to prove up and install the mooring by a certain date, and I had not done so, and that time is now come and gone. In the meantime, I told him, can we hold off until we hear back from the Coastal Commission on what their findings are? Among other things, there was also technical glitches on my end because I had to have another mooring inspector install the mooring. So, in any case, the Coastal Commission just recently came back and they contacted me. I don't know if they had a chance to contact the city, but they told me that yes, indeed, this was an issue, and that I would be in violation of the Coastal Commission if I were to have the mooring installed there without these proper inspections first. So I didn't do anything. The time has lapsed. I come before you on two grounds, the first of which is to see if I could get an extension to the installing of the mooring, based on the fact that now I understand that a marine survey is going to be needed to be conducted. That's kind of issue number one. Issue number two is I'm just wondering if there's any more clarification as to the fact that shortly during all of this transpiring, Mr. Croman informed me that he had removed my company from the certified list of marine inspectors. And I attached his words that I thought I recorded as best I could from our conversation, that he had the authority to do that. And yes, there was an unfortunate event in the harbor that I take full responsibility for. I was dinging around some people, and there were not enough life vests in the dinghy. My understanding is that Mick thought that was grounds for removing the company from the inspector list, even though that was me as a private individual, which had nothing to do with any operations at the time of or anything of that nature. So, in conclusion, I don't know if you guys have any questions for me, or but that is the current situation. So I'm wondering two things. First of all, the extension, and secondly, why the company was removed and whether it was appropriate under these circumstances.
So Commissioner Kramer has a question for you.
Yeah, I have some questions, Mr.
Sure.
Could you tell us something more about your company? How long has it been in operation? What kind of
yeah, certainly.
Work experience you have? And,
right.
How long you've been permitted to do this?
Correct, yeah. The company, I requested the proposal February 13th, and shortly after that I had a conversation with Mr. Croman. He said, yes, by the looks of your RFQ, everything is great, and by the time March came around, he had sent out a new letter to all of the mooring people with the revised list. In regards to my history, the company I've been running as a private company, but we recently incorporated. I'm a member, as are some other people. We have, luckily, due to the proximity of UCSB, my wife has actually just finished a master's in marine microbiology there, so we have a lot of good friends who work there. The ocean physics lab there does install moorings throughout the world, anywhere from very small temporary moorings to gigantic offshore tsunami, gauges and all that kind of stuff out in the middle of the Pacific. And I'm fortunate to have good friends who decided that they would be happy to, on a part-time basis, partake in this company. So we have a good 20 years of mooring experience in that regard.
Okay, thank you. And could you also tell me exactly what the Coastal Commission said to you, and how long ago it was that you spoke with them, and when they told you that that the city was apparently in violation?
Yeah, well, I had first mentioned it, that I thought the city might be in violation, to Mr. Croman back in May. And he said he didn't think that was the case, but he would be, more than welcome to look into anything that I brought forward. So I went ahead and emailed him, and he got me in contact with Mr. Triberg, and Mr. Triberg and I had a discussion on the phone. He said yes, that could be a sticky point. That there's the chance it could be, and he said he would contact the commission, and when he found out, he would get back to me. I did receive a message from him late last week, or mid last week, actually. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to return his call just yet, but the commission actually called me up just earlier today, of all things. And Pat Wiesart with the commission spoke with me, and he said that yes, indeed, it did look like the survey would need to be conducted. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers the question.
Okay.
I assume that the city will explain. I mean, you say that the commission said that it did look like as though there should be a survey.
That is correct. Yeah,
I mean,
special
I think
condition.
it's a little bit beyond our abilities to decide yes or no and right and wrong and so forth.
Correct. Right.
Thank you very much for your response.
Commissioner Watson.
Were you thinking to use this alleged Coastal Commission irregularity to buy yourself some time so you wouldn't have to perform in the time required?
No, not at first. I didn't want it to be a sticking point at all, and I mentioned it to him simply because he had said I'd been acting in an unprofessional and manner, and he was going to, he was using some pretty strong language to me. And I said, well, I looked into it myself, and it looked like you haven't followed all of your, dotted all your I's and T's either in regards to this. And he said, well, no, that's just not the case. I'm sorry, I'm speaking to Mr. Comment here. This was our conversation. And he said, no, as far as I know, we're totally in compliant. And I said, well, here's what I found. I don't want to bring this up or anything, but look, these are these difficulties I'm having with pretty much there's only 2 companies on that list that could install the mooring for me. Because the mooring is a large mooring, it requires the 2,000 pounds of dead weight and then another roughly 1,500 pounds worth of chain to be put on the bottom. So you need a large boat. Danny Castagnola has such a large boat. The only other company is Seaflex, and they are based out of Los Angeles, I believe, and they come up here once every now and then to do a bunch at once if they can help it. Otherwise, the cost is rather prohibitive.
So this company that you have formed, how many moorings has it installed?
I'm sorry, which one?
Your company.
We have not installed any moorings here under this program yet.
Okay, so your company has no experience.
No history. No, we only
no
just
history.
Right, correct. We only just became certified to install moorings here as of February.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question, Mr. Fink, and that is, I know we've been doing the mooring thing, and we had a redrawing. What was your original, with no extensions, your original prove-up date to put a mooring in?
I believe that would have been the end of March of this year.
Okay.
And
go ahead. If there's and unless there's something else that was my only question. Unless there's something else that you want to.
No, I want to applaud the city. They've done a great job with the program. I have no ill feelings towards them whatsoever. I just want to make sure I did it right. I'm kind of one of those people who I want to make sure I'm doing things correctly. That's why I even asked him afterwards, he mentioned that after my company had been on the approved list, you can't install it yourself. As your company can. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that's a conflict of interest. I'll look at other companies. Mr. Common was very gracious to extend that deadline a bit further, and that's actually at the time when I then discovered this other discrepancy. So,
which was the alleged irregularity?
The problem with having the inspections done within a certain amount of time, correct, with the Coastal Commission. So it's been a kind of a long process with all sorts of things propping up here and there. And another issue was the chain that was required. It's 1 1/4 inch chain, which is very difficult to find. You can go to 1 1/2 inch chain, which you can beat the minimums, but 1 1/2 inch chain becomes much more expensive than 1 1/4. It's not just a small increase. It's kind of like boat size. You go from a 40-foot boat to a 60-foot boat. It's only 1 inch to 1 1/4, but the amount of volume increases significantly, and it becomes much more expensive. And I had to find some of that chain. Nobody around here had any, so I ended up going down to Los Angeles to get some.
Prior to March, when you had prove-up, which would mean then that would be sometime back around the first of the year, what suppliers of that chain did you contact prior to the end of March?
Just a handful.
Did you place an order for the chain?
No, I did not at that time.
Then how could you have proved up?
Correct. I couldn't have proved up by the March.
Okay.
I had spoken to Mr. Crumb before that to get an extension, and he had graciously done that. So.
Okay. So do you have another question?
Yeah, I have a question. You're asking for an extension. How much of an extension are you asking for? Since you had an extension apparently from March to when? April or?
Till just earlier last month.
Okay.
I believe it was around the 17th or so. He wanted me to.
17th of June.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so
And-
what are you asking for now?
Well, I essentially have all the equipment ready to go at this point. I do need to contact Danny Castagnola, who has the large boat, that's the vessel that's capable of installing it. And he, unfortunately, because he's the only boat in this area, he does a lot of work for the oil companies, and his availability kind of comes and goes. However, I'm prepared to have everything ready by, all the gear assembled and be ready to put on his boat by late this weekend, for example. And then hopefully, if his time permits, that he could then drop it, because as of right now, my company is, like Mick said, there's a conflict of interest. I can't do it myself.
Well, to me, it makes sense. I mean, inspecting one's own work. I mean,
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Kronman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Fink for his gracious approach to this and his collegial attitude, though I must admit, before we begin, I'm going to tell you a somewhat different story. I'm going to speak to the mooring permit and prove-up and inspector list issues, and then my colleague, Mr. Treiberg, will speak to the Coastal Commission issues, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair. As Mr. Fink mentioned, he was issued a permit, it was December 17th of '07. His expected prove-up date was on March 17th. And before I describe sort of a brief chronology of this, I think it's important that we all understand that staff's job/challenge/interest in this is to, on one hand, create as this relates to the mooring inspector list, is to have a list of individuals who are qualified, a robust list of individuals, as robust as possible, who are qualified to do this work, but relative to the qualifications, making sure that these individuals and these companies are good enough and experienced enough to not unduly jeopardize the safety and security of the mooring project and, of course, the boats and people involved with it. So this isn't to, whine about it from staff's perspective. It's just to advance to you what the balance is that we wrestle with. I wish there were 20 people on the mooring inspector list, but it's difficult to find mooring inspectors who are qualified, can do the work, can stand by it, can do the re-inspections, and keep the mooring areas sound. So Mr. Fink was issued a provisional assignment on the 17th of December, which made his prove-up, of course, March 17th. And a week before that, he requested to be put on, week before his prove-up date, Mr. Fink requested to be put on the mooring inspector list. He advanced to you, Commissioner Kramer, some of the notions in his response to the RFQ, his ability to do this, the capabilities of the people who were part of his company and what have you. And I, per City Council resolution, enabled by that resolution, added his company, Marine Work, Inc., to the list of contractors. Quite frankly, it never occurred to me that Mr. Fink would expect that he would be able to use that certification to put his own mooring in. And it was only a week after that, on the 17th, ironically or coincidentally, on the day his prove-up was due, that we had the conversation on the phone when I explained to him that any reasonable individual, he said, where is it in the code and where is it in the resolution? And I agreed that it wasn't, but it really certainly wouldn't pass the test of reasonableness to allow an individual to put their own mooring in and sign on the bottom line saying it met the city's ground tackle specifications. There's a reason for that separation between the inspector and the inspectee. Meanwhile, he described to us that he was having challenges getting the equipment. He was having challenges getting an inspector to do the work. And Mr. Fink is correct that sometimes the inspectors aren't always available when the provisional permittees need them to be available. These boats, these companies have other jobs. They do offshore oil work, maintaining offshore oil cans and buoys and workboat jobs and what have you. Other contractors clean hulls and throughout the harbor and have prior obligations. So we tend to, in general, accommodate provisional mooring permittees a week, 2 weeks, even a month, 6 weeks. We've been known to stretch it out. But there comes a point where it becomes obvious that we're going down a road out of which there is no escape in terms of length of time. Mr. Fink described to us in fact, it was April 22nd, according to our logs, that his prove-up should be, quote unquote, any day now. That was on April 22nd. And after that, we kept calling him, and we would leave messages. We didn't get much return call. We finally contacted him on May. He called us on May 14th, and told us he would, quote unquote, come in tomorrow to resolve these mooring prove-up issues. He didn't come in the next day, and ultimately we were into June, and with no action toward the prove-up, I announced to Mr. Fink that my intention to cancel his mooring permit opportunity. It's important to realize that now by May 13th, June 13th, we're fully 6 months past his sign-up date and 3 months past his prove-up date. He's the only individual in the 2+ year history of this program that has extended the timeline that far, and the only person to whom we've accommodated that long. Everybody by that time, if they weren't going to prove up, they gave up the ghost, or if they were going to prove up, they got it done and got the paperwork in, and we assigned them the permit. Finally, I spoke with him on the 13th and told him that he had until 5 p.m. on June 27th to prove up. I also spoke directly at that time with the mooring inspector with whom Mr. Fink was working, and that individual explained to me an entirely different story than Mr. Fink has advanced tonight, relative to the fact that Mr. Fink was putting together his own mooring gear. And once again, Mr. Fink may be the only, or if he isn't the only, one of the very, very few individuals who's put their own, assembled their own mooring gear for the inspector to deploy, as opposed to most provisional permittees tell the mooring inspector, I need XYZ, how much is it? Boom, and the mooring inspector provides the mooring ball, the chain, the ground tackle, the anchor, the whole deal. The mooring inspector described to me a situation in which Mr. Fink had not only dragged the city way past a reasonable timeline, but it also imposed on his time and cost him money in terms of start and stop and start and stop. He also told me that in his estimation, what had been described to him by Mr. Fink as to what he was going to deploy, or what he expected the inspector to deploy, the inspector now, of course, has to inspect the whole thing first before he puts it down, because it's not gear that the inspector supplied, it's the gear that the provisional mooring permittee supplied, that he didn't think at that point it would even meet the city's ground tackle specifications. So that being said, I stuck with the deadline because I had called the inspector to see if there are any mitigating circumstances that should lead the city in another path and cause us to provide even more opportunity and, quite frankly, add, grace upon accommodation upon grace to see if this gentleman could comply. Hearing none, I called Mr. Fink on the 27th to remind him that he had until 5 p.m. that evening to comply. He said he was aware of that. He didn't comply, and following that, he was sent a letter letting him know that he was no longer being considered as a permittee for the mooring field. And I also, on the 13th of June, before his final prove-up date, based on the following, and it was not at all, and I apologize if I sent the wrong message to Mr. Fink or regarding this. It had nothing to do with him being contacted by Harbor Patrol in his dinghy without any life jackets. It had to do with his lack of performance and lack of good judgment relative to proving up. It had to do with what I was hearing from the mooring inspector about the way he was cobbling together gear that probably wouldn't meet the city's ground tackle specifications. And it had to do with the city's responsibility to do the best it could to ensure that moorings established by any company are safe and sound and can be depended upon. Mr. Fink, and he was deleted from the list at that point, and I emailed the mooring inspectors. I apologize to Mr. Fink. I didn't at that time email a letter or send a letter to the mooring permittees. We were at fault in that regard. I probably should have, in case he had clients pending. Probably did him an unintentional disservice. Mr. Fink was also correct in noting that another individual early on in the process, a boat had broken loose from the mooring, and in flat, calm weather and actually had hit the beach. This is true, and as a result, a number of things happened. The mooring permittee and the inspector got together, and all the repairs were made on the individual's boat, and at the same time, that inspector was immediately dropped from the list because it was obvious that that company had installed shoddy gear. So the reason I'm explaining all this is really to underscore the notion that we err to the cautious relative to who we certify as inspectors. It also underscores the reasons why we remove Mr. Fink from the list. And I think that concludes my response, Mr. Chair, unless you have any questions.
Thank you, Mick. Does anybody have any questions for Mick? Carl?
Chairman Kelly and Commissioners, this program went before the Coastal Commission in the spring of 2006, and whenever the Coastal Commission approves a project, typically do it with what they call prior to conditions. And one of the conditions was to go and survey some of the mooring sites before they would actually issue the actual permit. So Commission approval does not equal a permit. In July of 2006, we went out and we surveyed 20 representative sites, forwarded that report to the Coastal Commission. The following month, August 2006, they gave us the permit. The following month, September 2006, I believe, we held a lottery here. Mick offered up the moorings to the first 43 people or whomever off the list, and 43 said they would like to pursue this, and it was their opportunity to prove up. We completed the surveys in September and December of 2006, and in the subsequent prove-up time, which I believe was 90 days after they request or suggest they're interested, 30 of the actual mooring applicants proved up. This is something we didn't really anticipate. We kind of figured there was so much demand. I believe there was over 70 applicants that we'd get all 43 filled up, or 45 or whatever it is, but they didn't. Subsequent to that, we had another lottery in October of 2007, which I think most of you commissioners remember. And Mick has been offering more moorings to fill the rest of the mooring site, and Mr. Fink is one of those. In June of this year, this was brought to my attention regarding when the surveys occurred and when the moorings had to be installed. It's actually between 15 days and 180 days after you do a biological survey that you have to install the mooring. I did advance this to the Coastal Commission. Unfortunately, the staff member was on vacation. Took her a couple of weeks to get back to me, and which was about a day before I actually called and left a message with him. She said technically we were in violation because it had been over 180 days. This situation was something that neither we at the Waterfront nor the Coastal Commission anticipated as being a problem. We were almost overzealous in complying with our permit conditions, and lo and behold, it kind of bit us because no one thought that it would take greater than 180 days to install all of the moorings. I also spoke with the gentleman that Mr. Fink referred to. I forgot his name, Pat Bercier, I believe. He is an enforcement officer with the Coastal Commission. I spoke with him today about this, and we discussed our option, which is to request an amendment to the existing permit whereby we wouldn't have to, after every 180 days, whenever there's a reissuance or another lottery, go and resurvey the mooring. The mooring site has been surveyed. There are no sensitive resources. Coastal resources are protected through this process. Coastal Commission staff has acknowledged that. Nevertheless, technically, we're in violation of the permit if we install a mooring after 180 days after it's inspected. I'll be sending them a letter in the next week requesting this, what we would call an immaterial amendment to the permit, and there's a good likelihood we will not be required to resurvey a mooring. Maybe every 5 years we'll have to dive the area in general to see that some habitat doesn't develop eel grass or kelp bed or something like that. But typically they're very reasonable, and they're confident in that the resource has been protected and that we've done everything that we can to comply with our permit conditions. And that concludes my part of the explanation. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Carl. Are there any questions on Commissioner Kramer?
Could you repeat exactly when the last inspection was done?
Chair Kelly, Commissioner Kramer, it was in December of 2006. Okay. So anything installed after June 2007 would have been beyond the 180 days.
Commissioner Watson.
Yeah, just a couple of questions here. One, the certification for being on the inspector's list, what constitutes being certified to be a certifier?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Watson, it's based on experience. It's based on ability to provide a platform to install moorings. It's based on meeting insurance requirements. It's based on knowledge of mooring equipment, mooring installations, ocean conditions, and all those kinds of basic.
Okay, so the city does the certification of the inspectors.
That's correct.
Now I've heard three terms used with regard to installing the mooring. One of them is prove up, another is inspector, and a third is installer. Now I think that all three of those are the same entity, are they not?
Well, actually not. The last two are. Prove up is a term we sort of, shall we say, borrowed from the Homestead Act in the 19th century, where you had to, milk your cows or grow some trees or, prove up on land that, or erect a house, that land that the federal government granted you. This is basically the same thing. Prove up in the way we've used it in this program means in the 90-day period you need to establish the mooring, put our boat on it, prove that you are the registered or documented owner of that vessel, and pay the first year's annual permit fees of $250.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions or comments? Well, I don't see, this is not an agenda item that asks us to do anything, and my take on it is that unless the commission feels something needs to be done, we've received the report, and unless one of the commissioners wants to, Commissioner Watson has his microphone on.
Mr. Chair, based on what I've heard, I don't feel compelled to do anything.
So noted, Commissioner Watson. Commissioner Kramer, you're holding it?
Yeah, I feel that the city should have some changes that have it written that one cannot inspect one's own tackle, one's own mooring there. And that's, I think you're on the route to doing that anyway. I think it's unfortunate if Mr. Fink can prove up by this weekend and providing the material, the tackle, the gear, and everything that meets all requirements, that he would not be able to do that. But I'm not in the position to be able to make a decision. So I also basically have no comment.
So I think the commission is of the opinion that we've heard both sides of the story, but do not feel compelled to intervene on this, which is one of those like Supreme Court things where we've heard the argument, but we're passing. So I think we're going to let it stand as it stands. Well, we'll leave it up to the staff, and the staff is dealing with it, and see no reason to intervene.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that's exactly what I was going to say. This is a request from the public. They have the ability to place this on the agenda, and if the commission so chooses to intervene, then they would provide us with some input or direction. And I think we've done a good job of that to date with Mr. Fink's issues. We may agree to disagree about certain things, but that's part of the process.
Whoops. Okay, comments. So we'll go with Commissioner Kramer.
Yeah, Mr.
Okay, Commissioner Watson.
I was just going to say, the applicant is certainly invited to make his case, and he did, and I'm glad that he had his opportunity to present it. And I just want to make it clear from my standpoint that anyone is welcome to and encouraged to present their case to us.
Commissioner Kramer.
And I would make the recommendation that there be continuing communication between Mr. Fink and the Waterfront Department. That's my recommendation for what it's worth.
Thank you for coming down, Mr. Fink. You're welcome. Mr. Bridley, Commission Staff Communications.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. The item that, again, we talked about last month, and I alluded to at the beginning of the meeting, was whether or not it was necessary or appropriate for the next meeting in August. I didn't, unfortunately, bring my calendar. I thought I did. Mary, do you remember the third Thursday, the 21st in August? The two items that we currently have pending, we have not made much progress on. These items have been pending for several months as it relates to the visitor center lease. It's possible it'll be ready by then, but we're uncertain. I think last month Scott reported to you that Jeff at the Minnow was having some personal family matters associated with his father, and I don't think there has been much made progress on his lease negotiations either. Again, not saying they wouldn't be available by August. I know I'm going to be on vacation the week before the 21st. I would be back by the 21st, if I remember correctly. Actually, no, I'm back on the 24th. I'm gone the 16th through the 24th, so I would be gone during that period of time. Again, that doesn't mean that these capable managers couldn't conduct a meeting. They've done it before. I don't know what the commission's vacation schedules are for August, so this would be the appropriate time to discuss it.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, it's highly unlikely that I'll be here. I'll probably be in Catalina.
All right.
Catalina.
Will?
I will probably be on vacation as well.
I will most likely be here.
And that it goes for myself. But the big item, I think, is there anything pressing on the two items that are pending? Because if they're not time sensitive, then I think we can take the pressure off ourselves and potentially, unless you want to call it otherwise, John, it doesn't sound like we have a need to have a meeting in August. And if that pops up, we can always try to have one. But otherwise, why don't we flag it?
Mr. Chair, neither of these items is particularly pressing. Minnow Cafe is jumping through the hoops with the health department, and so we will start our discussions next week, but we're working concurrently with the health department, and you know how that can take a while.
Yes.
So, and the sailing club has had their lease document to review for several months now, and they just haven't quite gotten to it, so I don't think they're overly concerned with it either. So I think we could easily take both of those in September.
Okay. Unless there's concern otherwise, Mr. Bradley, I think we can dispense with August meeting.
So noted, and I thank you. We will do the proper noticing and posting for the cancellation of the August meeting.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that motion. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. We're adjourned.